I'm so glad to welcome this wonderfully interdisciplinary group to this lecture. I am Alexandra Brown. I'm from the Department of Religion. We, together with the Classics Department and the Provost Office, are sponsoring this visit of Dr. Tessa Rajak, who is the class of '63 visiting scholar. And she is a magnificent visiting scholar. She has done exactly, I think, what that fund is meant to do. That is to say, she's been interdisciplinary. She has traveled around this campus. She's talked to different groups. She's done an amazing amount of work in just a few days. And we're getting used to having her here and would love to keep her. But she has a great East Coast tour ahead of her. Leaving here to go to UVA tomorrow, where she will speak, then going to the Union Theological Seminary in Richmond, and from there up to Boston College, very much in demand before she goes back to the UK a few days hence. So we are happy to welcome her. We're grateful to the various funds that have allowed this to happen, including the Philip F. Howerton Fund, which is a fund within the Religion Department. I'd like to mention also that her husband, Harry Rajak, is with us somewhere. Here he is. Also distinguished scholar of law from the University of Sussex, emeritus. And he has been working too. He's done 3 talks at the Williams School. He's an expert in bankruptcy law, so if anybody wants to talk to him after the lecture, he may take some clients, I don't know. So we're happy to have you, Harry. Thank you for being also such a gracious guest. So I have to say, this person to my right here seems utterly indefatigable. She has done so many things over the days. Also a person of enormous generosity. So thank you very much for who you are, for being with us for this event, which is very exciting. I'm so happy that you're here and looking forward to this lecture. The whole thing wouldn't have happened had it not been for our colleague, Dr. George Karras, who is a research scholar in the Classics Department, who about a year ago said, it would be really fun to bring Tessa Rajak here. That began a year of preparation at which George has been tirelessly working for this, especially the last several months, to cross every T. And so we owe this visit in a way to George's imagination and his friendship with Tessa. So I want to ask George to introduce her formally to you before we hear her lecture on the topic, How the Jewish Writer Josephus Shaped Christianity.
Good evening. I would just want to echo everything that Alex said regarding the pleasure it is to have Tessa and Harry with us these few days. And this sort of started in 2003. I was in Oxford for about 7 months, and Tessa and I were discussing over coffee one day, Josephus, as it were, and I sort of floated the idea, what if, would you be interested? And she didn't say no, so we kept talking. And a few years later, she is here, and we couldn't be more pleased that she's been with us these few days. Tessa and I share a few fondnesses. One is for Oxford, 2, its university. We participated in the Oriental Studies seminar on Jewish history in the Greco-Roman world. Tessa has been at some time convener, and she's given numbers of papers there. I gave a paper there last October. And we also have associated with the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. Tessa is a permanent member there, and they are good enough to enable me to become a part-time member when I'm in Oxford. We also share similar mentors, and one person that is very fond to both of us, who recently passed away, is Geza Vermesh, the very great Jewish studies Qumran expert. And then finally, Tessa and I share an interest, in her case, much more of an interest, in my case, an interest as well, in trying to unravel the intricacies of Josephus' thought and his writings. But if I were to stop there, I would be admitting many vital features of Tessa's story. She is a distinguished British expert on Hellenistic and Roman-era Judaism. Her expertise is as a historian of social and cultural history of the Jews in the Hellenistic and Roman period, as well as Jewish culture itself. Her work reflects a keen interdisciplinary eye towards the interrelationships between ancient Romans, Greeks, Jews, and the early Christians. Tessa was educated at Oxford University and has a BA in Classics, and has taken her doctorate in the Faculty of Classical Archaeology and Classical Literature and Philosophy. For many years, she was at the University of Reading in the UK as Professor of Ancient History in the Department of Classics. In 2008, she retired from that post and has since been associated with Oxford as the Senior Research Fellow of Somerville College and Senior Research Associate of the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies in the Faculty of Oriental Studies. Tessa, in her career, held numerous visiting appointments and affiliations in the U.S. at Yale, Williams College, the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, the Center for Hellenic Studies in Washington, D.C., as well as similar appointments in Israel, Germany, and Australia. Also, she has lectured in China, Brazil, and various European and Scandinavian countries. With the publication of her first book, Josephus, the Historian and His Society, Tessa became known as an international expert in thought and social, cultural, historical world of Josephus, and the book is recognized as what helped catalyze renewed interest in the ancient Jewish historian. She is also responsible for contributing to creating a newly defined field of study devoted to him. Her other publications include The Jewish Dialogue with Greece and Rome, Studies in Cultural and Social Interaction, Translation and Survival on the Greek Bible. And she also edited a volume, Philosophy and Power in the Greco-Roman World, essays in honor of Miriam Griffin, her undergraduate tutor in classics. And she also has edited a volume on Jews among pagans and Christians. In total, books, edited volumes, and articles, Tessa's contribute over 75 written pieces, and she's not stopping anytime soon. Her current collaborative project, shared with 7 other international scholars, is entitled The Reception of Josephus in Jewish Culture from 1750 to the Present. She is a co-director and primary investigator with Martin Goodman, the professor of Jewish Studies at Oxford. And Josephus has been critical in the formation of modern Jewish identity. So it's with great delight and great pleasure for me to introduce to you Professor Tessa Rajak, who will speak on the topic, Josephus, How a Jewish Historian Shaped Christianity.
So now this is all on, isn't it? Can people see the slides in terms of the amount of light? Because I have a very fancy gadget for, I could play with it for another 10 minutes. But, right. So this is, as you can imagine, a big story. Well, it could be a tiny story, because how on earth did Josephus the Jew shape Christianity? Thought it was Jesus and Paul. But actually, it's a very big and long story, going from the days of Josephus himself, the period in which I work, to the present day. So how long have I got? 45 minutes. If it's okay if I go to past?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. So first of all, it's for me to thank people here for their immense generosity and for the wonderful time that Harry and I have been having here. And if I'd have known what a lovely place it is, and what a welcoming and what an impressive place, I would have said yes much sooner, George. I'd have said, take me there straight away. It's been great. I've loved interacting with such bright students, with colleagues, and thank you, George, for inventing it, and thank you, George and Alex, for crossing an infinite number of T's and dotting so many I's. Alex has been working, toiling for the last few weeks, and even these 2 days, I wouldn't have glided effortlessly from building to building, assignment to assignment, room to room, computer to computer, lunch to lunch without her. It's been terrific and very stimulating, and including the colloquium we had yesterday with a small bunch of colleagues who came all the way from Duke to join us. That was a special treat. So thank you, and thank you to Sharon Kirk, who's sitting at the back and has crossed more T's and dotted more I's than anybody. Thank you, Sharon, and for organising this room and everything so beautifully. So, Flavius Josephus, also known as Josephus, son of Mattathias, or Ben Matityahu, also known as Josephus the priest sometimes, Yosef HaKohen, is probably the best known and most read of Greek and Roman historians, surprisingly enough. Maybe that doesn't say so much to an audience of today, because you'll all be thinking, well, who reads that many Greek and Roman historians anyway? But in the past, of course, the classics was very big. And indeed, I think we can say that he is, of all historians through the centuries, both in Europe and in the Americas, one of the very most read. And I mean right from before the ancient world ended, through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance and the early modern period, the 18th and 19th centuries to today, or even tomorrow. And now we will see that image, that's Josephus. Well, of course, it isn't. It's an ancient portrait, one of the very distinguished collection in the museum that you see named there in Copenhagen, owned by the Carlsberg Brewery, or set up by them. But it's been identified traditionally as Josephus. This goes right back. I had a student investigate it. For why? Well, it's a fairly young man with a Flavian hairstyle, so the right period, and they think a sort of Jewish appearance, a Jewish nose. I don't know the difference between a Jewish and a Roman nose, but that's Josephus for us. At the moment, you'll see that portrait actually on the front of a number of books and texts and commentaries. I'm sure George has seen it many times. Some here may remember Josephus from Sunday school, not looking quite like that. In fact, when I taught my Josephus course at Williams College, which I had the pleasure of doing, two women students, as it happens Afro-American, told me that they'd taken the course for the very reason that they'd been taught at Sunday school that Josephus said something about Jesus in his writings, and they were intrigued. So this sort of tradition going, we'll come back to the reference to Jesus. Visitors to Israel, by contrast, will see quotations from Josephus on the signage all over the World Heritage Site of Masada, that rock in the Judean desert, where, according to the historians' dramatic narratives, the Jewish rebels made their last stand against the Romans in 73 to 4 CE. Those who read into modern controversies about the Masada myth and the Masada complex in the relation to the modern state of Israel, I'll say a little bit more about that at the end of my lecture, will soon see that what is at stake is, amazingly, the truthfulness or otherwise of none other than Josephus's narratives in those very modern sociological, political, religious debates. Josephus used to be, well, just everywhere. He was even requested in the Tower of London as one of 3 chosen books when Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, one of Henry VIII's prominent councillors and uncle of 2 of his wives, expecting to be beheaded any day, asked to have Josephus's Antiquities brought to him, presumably in a Latin version. One of the other 2 books was Augustine's City of God, as a matter of interest. The learned Duke did in fact survive to be eventually released, though his son was executed. We do not know if the Duke ever received his desired Josephus. On Josephus in the Italian Renaissance, one scholar has written, the continued popularity of the ancient Jewish historian in 14th through 16th century Italy is well known. The dissemination of his writings at this time amply charted, manuscripts of Josephus were zealously sought out by and exchanged among humanist scholars. And Josephus, after Tacitus, was the most frequently translated ancient historian, published more often than any of his Greek counterparts. And as for those Jewish readers of Josephus who came along later, I'll be showing, I hope, how his fate among them is closely intertwined with his Christian afterlife. Indeed, the relationship between the Jewish and the Christian Josephus closely mirrors the Jewish relationship with non-Jewish Europe. There were so many reasons for chasing Josephus, and different parts of his voluminous writings were highlighted in different periods and places. That's come out particularly clearly from the project of which George spoke, Oxford Reception Project. So, for example, rather like the Italian humanists, so the 17th century heretical Jewish thinker from Amsterdam, Baruch Spinoza, found it essential to challenge Josephus's political ideas in supporting his own political pantheistic view of the world. Josephus had coined the term theocracy. So who was Josephus? Josephus was a very prominent Jerusalem priest of royal Hasmonean descent. I apologise for those of you to whom this is sort of a really old hat. He was first a reluctant participant in, and then the chronicler of the disastrous Jewish revolt of 66 to 73 to 4 CE against the power of Rome. He had witnessed the fall of the temple from the Roman camp. He was a passionate and vituperative critic of the Zealots and the other rebel factions who had, in his view, brought about the catastrophe, the demise of his city and nation, the fall of the temple. The last half of his life, from the early 70s through to the 90s, we don't know exactly when he died, was spent largely in Rome, where he was allowed to live, at first in the former house of the Emperor Vespasian, formerly commander of the Roman legions in Judea. In his Jewish War, writing in Greek, Josephus revisited the war, and he depicted and lamented the fall of the temple. He came back to this subject in his later life, Bios, a sort of autobiography, defending in detail his defense of the Galilee against his military defense of the Galilee against the Romans. In his Jewish Antiquities, again in Greek, he retold biblical history from the creation, and then offered a continuous narrative of the history of the Jews right down to his own day. And he documented the Jewish communities in the land of Israel and in the diaspora within the Roman imperial context. and earlier, actually. In his final work against Apion, he continued to explain the essence of Judaism, its antiquity and its superiority to pagan systems. And finally there, he defended the Jewish people and religion against various pagan slanderers, who he quotes at some length, mostly Greco-Egyptians, and he produced against them a dazzling array of refutations, some of which had quite long life in Christian apologetic and in other forms of polemic. So what do I mean by my lecture title? Well, in a sense, I suppose to provoke. You'll see that the PowerPoint version of the title, How Josephus the Jew Shaped Christianity, was even slightly more provocative. And actually, I think overall, the title should be How He Shaped Christianity and Judaism. He was born then in 37, i.e. pretty soon after the crucifixion of Jesus. He had no interaction with Paul, although Josephus's travelling trajectories around the Mediterranean through Syria, Greece and Asia Minor, including Damascus, Antioch, Ephesus and so on, while much more limited, were rather similar to the apostles, and I've suggested that we should compare their Jewish diasporas. George has compared them in detail and continues to work on this intriguing topic. Each had a famous shipwreck. Josephus's writings, as they've come down to us, say very little about the life and death of Jesus Christ, and certainly... That's not mine, is it? No.
It is.
Oh my God. Oh, that is pathetic. Thanks.
I don't know where it is.
Nobody ever phones me.
Well, now you're Washington and Lee. It will happen.
Actually, it's from UVA, I think.
Oh, well, don't answer UVA.
Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, certainly Josephus' works say nothing about the Christian communities that were coming into being during his lifetime, an intriguing question to speculate why. But that's next to nothing is significant, and I'll come back to it because there is something, and it will be the seed of something very big. How far Josephus was aware of a new religious direction at all evolving in his own time within and on the edge of Judaism remains mysterious. His own contribution to the development was unwitting and unintended. Yet without him, Christian identities would have had to have been built on different foundations, as we'll see. Josephus was all things to all men. Let's go to another portrait. This is one of many engravings that you get as frontispieces to the English translations and others. They're very varied. I rather like that one where he's looking, I think, rather wily. It's definitely a sort of Orientalist representation, a sort of garbed, Oriental, wise, canny figure. Less likely to be Josephus. Rather wealthy, doing all right for himself, maybe. Beturbaned. Less likely to be Josephus than the Flavian bust, but a very familiar figure. So we'll have him up for a bit. Temperament, ability and circumstances combined to make Josephus the most multi-talented and many-faceted of individuals. Truly a man for all seasons, to use a term applied to Thomas More. The twists and turns, the ups and downs in his life were quite extraordinary, and even the range of genre and objectives in his numerous writings were unusual for his day and age. There's quite a spread. He was everybody's historian, Jews and Romans, Greeks and Orientals, moderates and pacifists, martyrs and survivors, idealists and pragmatists. During his lifetime, Josephus was already famous, or rather notorious, for changing sides, and both him and his writings were already the object of vituperation and furious accusation. I figure that he fulfilled 5 different roles, including by his own account that of prophet, which we'll come back to. He had 4 statuses, including both slave and citizen at different times. He spanned 2 dramatically different eras, pre and post the 70 CE watershed when the temple fell. He resided in at least 3 locations across the Mediterranean, and I think possibly more. In his youth, he tried out 4 opposing Jewish sects. In Rome, he was the protege of 2 contrasting patrons, imperial patrons, and then a Greek freedman called Epaphroditus. He could be one of various identifiable figures. He operated in 4 languages and wrote in 2 of them, i.e. Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. He wrote in Aramaic and Greek. He addressed 4 different audiences, and Greeks, Romans, Jews, and non-Greek, Syrians, Egyptians, people like that. And most controversially, he took up, during the period of the Jewish revolt, those 2 opposing allegiances in the most clear-cut way possible. First appointed rebel general for the Galilee and the Golan. Later, after failure, survival, and surrender to the Roman leaders, he was first a prisoner of war and a slave, but then the friend, albeit an inferior, of the future emperors Vespasian and Titus as they cleaned up on the revolt in Judea. We really don't know for sure who valued Josephus in his own times, let alone who embraced him, though we believe he had a statue put up in Rome. I think Christians may have done it, I don't know, but we are told that. I like to think that in Jerusalem he'd been part of a group of once influential but now powerless moderates who sought to put a brake on the extremist rush to disaster. I not only like to think that, I think I can prove it, and that afterwards he belonged to a diaspora-wide society of elite Greek-speaking Jews, 2 of whom he married in succession. He had a wife from Crete, a wife from Alexandria. I think he got around. For all this dizzying variety, Josephus's was one of those lives that was defined forever by one unforgettable moment, that of his emergence into the light and the arms of the Roman generals from the Galilean cave where he had hidden after his failure to defend Jotapata against a Roman siege, the last confrontation in the Galilee, and where he had managed to evade the suicide pact agreed upon among his 40 companions. He and a companion did that. After visiting Yorktown last week, I keep thinking of the story that circulates there of Cornwallis hiding in a cave and wondering whether people had read Josephus to make that one up. There and then, of course, he was on the other side. There and then he tells us, well, he wasn't. There and then he tells us he blurted out a prophecy of Vespasian's future elevation, as I mentioned. When this came about 3 years later, Josephus was, by his own account, remembered, released, and honoured with the Roman citizenship. My suspicion is that there wasn't such a big time lapse. If you fast forward a year or 2, the Roman Empire was in some disarray, and it was possible to see that an emperor, that one or other general would emerge as at the top and take over the Roman state, and Vespasian by then could be seen as a contender by someone well connected. That's as may be. He remained quite close to Vespasian and even more to his son Titus for at least the next phase in his life, and he showers quite a bit of praise on Titus in his Jewish War. He knew how to praise emperors, which you had to do in the literature of the time. A survivor then, if ever there was one. A displaced person, a recorder of catastrophe, a casualty of war and circumstance, a split personality, a man racked by ambivalence, a man of hybrid identity, a mediator between systems. A bunch of applicable modern concepts comes to mind, making Josephus immediately relevant in our own day. With so many faces, can we then be surprised that Josephus's afterlife through the centuries was correspondingly diverse and equally colourful? This is a writer whose personality and biography continued to be turned over and over alongside his writings. The 2 were linked. Could a turncoat be trusted to tell the truth on anything? When he was not serving his own advantage, when was he not serving his own advantage? Had he been playing a double game all along, even when he'd pretended to support the rebellion? How far and deep had his betrayal gone? But what made Josephus indispensable? Evidently, his many faces helped secure his personal survival, but also his literary survival. Josephus the writer could be taken up in many different ways, and certainly within two different spheres. As a classical historian, who, so he tells us himself, had worked hard to follow the rules and norms of the history writing of his day, and that, of course, Roman writing, Greek and Roman writing were rule-bound in all sorts of ways, and for the most part had achieved the appropriate style. He had the advantage of being co-optable to the canon of classical authors. Thomas Jefferson's catalogue of the library he was donating to Congress after the fire of 1812, as meticulous in its construction as all his famous listings, has Josephus among the Greek and Roman historians in section 1, Ancient History, alongside Thucydides and others. And the classics, the study of the civilizations, and especially the literatures of ancient Greece and Rome, were still preeminent in that period of pre-modern Europe, and equally so in America. At the same time, Josephus had his niche in religious literature, in Christian literature, as Europe and America, in Europe and America in the medieval, in Europe in the medieval period, and even in the early modern period and on. He was a writer of sacred history, a contributor to strengthening the faith, and a companion to both testaments. You could have him beside you and sort of mine him to understand what was going on. Josephus's writings, in common with the entire legacy of Jewish writing in Greek, were transmitted solely by Christians down to today. That legacy included the diverse books of the Apocrypha in Protestant terms, books like the Maccabees, Judith, Tobit, Wisdom, some of them more biblical than others in style and content. Josephus was widely copied in manuscript and then in printed form. He was known, cited, used, illuminated, illustrated. From an early translation in Latin, he was in due course translated into vernacular languages, and for various reasons widely admired and respected, even if sometimes with varying degrees of ambivalence. He was recognized by most people who engaged with him as a Jew. Now that's not me, is it? No. Okay. What do we have here? Oh, I should be able to see it. Not yet. This will have its day. Though you see the sun is actually, I think, setting in it, but it will have its day. Josephus's writings came very early into the Christian tradition because of their formative use by Eusebius of Caesarea, the churchman who created the history of the church in the 4th century CE. Josephus was used for both historical and theological purposes, especially in the great church history, ecclesiastical history, and also in another work called the Preparation for the Gospel, Praeparatio Evangelica, which draws also on the Josephus's last work, the Against Appian. For the church history, particularly in the first book, Eusebius had both Josephus's Jewish War and his later work, the Antiquities, in front of him, and he brought them together in an intricate interweaving, for example, in recounting the death of Herod the Great. So Josephus makes the fabric of that famous work. The value of the Jewish War to Christian readers is immeasurable. We can point in the Jewish War to the repeated claim that the Jews had brought the destruction of the temple on their own heads, that they were in rebellion against God's will. We can point to the theology of Josephus, that God was transferring power away from the Jews to the Romans, something he keeps repeating. It's an explanatory device through his work. And we can point to the prophecies cited by Josephus about the destruction of the temple, which tie in with those of Jesus in the Gospels. Stone shall not stand upon another, and so forth. We can point to the graphic and horrendous descriptions of the fall of the temple that he gives us, and to the dispossession of its priests, of the agony and exile of the inhabitants. Christians particularly relished and retold the awful story of Maria, the mother who cooked and ate her own baby in the extremity of the siege and served up portions of the dish to the Roman soldiers who discovered her. Well, I'm sorry to have to tell you we're going to come back to her, albeit briefly in a little while. The Jews were being punished not only for deicide, killing Christ. They would continue to be visibly punished in the world for their persistence in unbelief. All these ideas are so much more valuable when articulated by one of their own, an eyewitness, a priest, and on his own self-assessment, a prophet. As a writer of 1676 put it, writing a preface to the first serious English translation of Josephus by Thomas Lodge, done at the beginning of the century, such prodigious effects of vengeance for the death of God might pass as incredible with those who have not had the happiness to be enlightened by the light of the gospel, if they were not related by a man of that very same nation, as considerable as Josephus was, he was an elite person, for his Bible, for his quality of priest, and for his virtue, i.e. the value of his testimony was important because he was a Jew and a significant one at that. The disasters are built up by Josephus into a great drama, and the storyline is punctuated by those theological affidavits of his own people's loss of divine favour. Josephus's own reasons and motives have, of course, been quite different. I'm convinced that he'd written out of despair, a kind of lamentation. In his dismay also, he was impelled to place the responsibility of the catastrophe in the place he thought it was due, to point the finger at the insane wickedness of the Jewish extremists who had rushed headlong into war in spite of all sane advice and many warnings from their elders and betters. He also then had written out of anger. And in stating that God's favour was passing to Rome, he was stating the obvious about the rise and fall of great powers, not consigning the Jews to eternal oblivion. The punishment of the Jews and the destruction of their nation and its dispersal among the nations are standard accompaniments to pre-modern editions of Josephus. It's there, and to early modern ones. Pre-modern in the sense of before the 20th century. It's there even where Josephus is packaged and presented as a classical text, as in the case of Thomas Lodge's translation. In such a publication, the description of Jewish suffering might seem to be not much more than a dramatic theme, packed with shock, horror, pathos, and tears. Thus, for example, Cundy's version of Whiston's translation, that we'll come to Whiston shortly, in 1806, advertises to the reader full coverage of those unparalleled calamities which mock the weak attempt of the artist's pencil. So this is shock horror writing. In a recent study, an English scholar, looking at the fall of Jerusalem in early modern English literature, argues strongly that the Protestant English of Shakespeare's day identified with the Jewish rebels against the oppression of Rome, because after all it made no difference whether it was the Catholic Church, i.e. Rome, or the Roman Empire. Protestants did regularly map themselves onto the Israelites of the Old Testament and identify with those. They were therefore, the author of this book, Beatrice Grove, suggests, perhaps empathising with the appalling sufferings endured by Josephus's fellow countrymen and so graphically recounted by him. However, I think this may sometimes be to underestimate the triumphalism, the sheer gloating that lurks behind the pathetic retelling. The identification with the Jews could never be complete anyway. History had changed its course, and the fate of the Jews of latter days was evidence that it had done so. We now have just, I thought this was quite interesting, this is the frontispiece of a translation by Maynard in the 18th century, late 18th century, I think, or early 19th, George Henry Maynard. It didn't have a very long life, but what we have here, and there's a description. Did I give you the description? Yes, here it is. Frontispiece, wherein is represented Josephus recording the antiquities and wars of the Jews, at whose feet are the emblems that characterize him as a warrior as well as a historian. That gave him credit. In this arduous task, he is assisted by the historic muse, who holds in one hand the mirror of truth, which reflects its rays on the Mosaic writings. I should go back to the image as I read this out, actually. No, I can't do. No, I need to. I will go back in a minute. And with the other points to ages past. In this group are Titus and his father Vespasian, the Roman emperor, who were the cause of the final destruction of Jerusalem. Now, Aaron and his brother Moses, the great lawgiver, trampling on idolatry. That's fine. But in the distance, the Roman army destroying the city of Jerusalem, over which are thunder and lightning, to denote its being through the vengeance of heaven, and behind is the setting sun, signifying the total destruction of Jerusalem. There you go. So that is the sort of spirit in which one might be reading Josephus's account of the fall of Jerusalem. But then why were his antiquities prized? The whole latter part of his life was spent composing in Rome this 20-volume work that I told you about. Its impact is perhaps less tangible than that of the Jewish War in terms of its thinking. And it's also less tangible in its content. There we find no fall of the temple, none of that, no suffering of the Jews. There are stories and violence too. For example, in the very long drawn-out saga of the paranoid monster monarch Herod the Great, and how he turned on his nearest and dearest. But there's nowhere as much excitement as in the Jewish War. It's not quite as riveting. There's politics, but there's some political theory which interested some readers, but not as much as in the polemical last work against Appian. So, also, the Antiquities are a very big 20-book history, it goes on and on, composed in the universal history genre that had emerged during the Roman period. Some of it covers ground that's traversed elsewhere. For example, it has the story of the translation of the Septuagint by the 72 sages from Jerusalem, the revolt of the Maccabees against King Antiochus, and King Herod, and many other things. But still, it's perhaps because it's so vastly varied and ceaselessly informative that there was a lot there for everybody. From the Christian perspective, there's obviously the entire world of Jesus and the disciples when we get down to the later books, the end of the work. The people of first century Judea, the Galilee, Samaria, information on their lives, the geography, the topography, the regimes they were under, times, dates, places, some of their customs and habits, even the natural life. We have detailed expositions of Herod's temple and the temple surrounds, complete with detailed measurements. The temple cult, notably the high priest's famous vestments and regalia and their symbolic mystical meanings. Even Josephus, who's no mystic, touches on those. All of the latter acquired a life of their own as illustrations to various editions of Josephus. We have the other architectural landmarks. We also have there at least something on the Jewish communities of many of the regions and cities that figures in the travels of that other Jewish writer of Greek, Paul of Tarsus. There are expansions of the historical material already covered in the Jewish War. And we find in the telling both embedded and explicit chronologies with attempts to bring together biblical and secular outside time systems. And first and foremost, surely, we must put the renowned Testimonium Flavianum, the paragraph on the miracles and popularity and execution of Jesus Christ, presented in the form in which we read it today, and that goes back a long way. I'll say more about whether it could be original or not in a minute, in Book 18 of the Antiquities. And so, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who wrought wonderful feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. I think that's my own translation. I can't remember now. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the anointed one, ho Christos. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place, no, I don't think it is my translation. Anyway, it's all right. Who had in the first place come to love him did not cease. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and myriads of other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still up to now not disappeared. So it looks like he's fairly keen on Jesus. Very few people think this is entirely authentic Josephus. It also interrupts his narrative of the procuratorship, the prefecture of Pilate, Pontius Pilate. But whether it's wholly an interpolation, a forgery, an added passage, and chesks were tampered with all the time in the ancient world, even more when by Christian transmitters and copyists, or whether it's entirely interpolated or just Josephus wrote something which got fiddled about with, we don't know. The earliest Christian observers, Origen and others in the 3rd century, don't seem to have known it. By Eusebius, who I told you about, it was in the text. So early on, it's in all our manuscripts, and often published separately as well. It's important, and sometimes added to the Jewish war as a sort of, appendix, or maybe at the beginning. The importance of the testimonium in the, as we call it, Testimonium Flavianum, the Flavian testimony, because Josephus, when he had been liberated, became called Flavius Josephus. Its importance in the European Christian valuation of Josephus can't be overestimated. It isn't just that here we have outside attestation to the life and death of Jesus and to a large following, though that in itself is pretty huge. It's that in this form, the well-placed Jewish author appears to endorse Jesus as not only a wise man with many followers, but as ho Christos, the anointed, and even to acknowledge the resurrection. He appeared to them restored to life, though you could read that as being they thought he had been. For many centuries, you could even read ho Christos as they called him the Christ, but it's difficult to do so. For many centuries, the testimonium was scarcely doubted as being real Josephus. But during the 16th century, when it became fashionable among the new kind of scholars to sniff out forgeries and to apply rational criteria to texts, a few began to question its authenticity or wholly to deny it, starting an academic and religious debate that went on for several centuries. During the same period and later, some studies still vindicated the testimonium, especially from within the Catholic Church. 2 short passages on John the Baptist and on the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, were almost universally regarded as genuine, and still on the whole are, though I have a few doubts about the James passage, which is there, but I think we'll pass over it because time is getting short. Josephus's afterlife took many forms. First, there were manuscripts of the original Greek and of the more widespread Latin versions. In the Middle Ages, some were adorned with beautiful illuminations, most often to books 5 and 6 of the war. But here we have a famous manuscript of the Antiquities by a very well-known illustrator, Jean Fouquet, in the 15th century. So this more or less already overlaps with the beginning of the printed versions of Josephus. First the Latin in the late 15th century, and then the Greek in the early 16th century. Learned commentaries elucidated the different part of the text, and provided background knowledge. Sometimes these were then reduced to brief footnotes in many texts, which really did help the readers. At the same time, we begin to get translations into different European languages, gathering pace in the late 15th and 16th centuries. This actually shows an earlier capture of Jerusalem by Pompey the Great in 63 BC, who first brought Judea and Jerusalem under Roman control. And he famously, Josephus describes it, went into the Holy of Holies and, surprise, surprise, found it empty. There was no cult statue. There was nothing like a pagan cult, and that's reported by many, many authors, Greek and Roman authors, as well as by Josephus. But this is sort of inverted. I now see the writings. I mean, this is what Getty Images does if you don't pay for your download, I suppose. In the English-speaking world, Josephus became almost synonymous with his 18th century translator, William Whiston, whose dates are 1667 to 1752. Let's see if Whiston's... Yes, there you go. Nice that it was a woman portraitist who did the original version of this. I only discovered that recently. The translation hit London in January 1737, when Whiston was aged 70, and a well-known, if not entirely well-respected figure. He was caricaturized also by more than one engraver, including a Hogarth, which I couldn't find the reproduction of. It was, however, I'm pretty sure, from the second quarter of the 19th century that this volume, or volumes, depending on which edition, came to occupy a place in the bookcase of so many British and American Christian households, including those that were quite modest, with bookcases that were pretty small. And since, amidst much else, Josephus did rewrite the Bible in the first 10 books of the Antiquities, putting it into a sort of nice narrative in Greek, this was quite suitable to be next to the Bible in your bookcase. And so in George Eliot's great novel Middlemarch, issued in 1871-2, the works of Josephus were to be found bound in calf among the very few books on the shelves of Mr. Featherstone, a horse dealer, and as you see, not a great intellectual, because the other items in this little group were Klopstock's Messiah, a poem, Culpeper, a 17th century herbal manual, and some issues of the Gentleman's Magazine. That's what he had. I'll leave that off. It's fascinating to study and sequence the many editions of Josephus, of Whiston, and he's still the translation that you'll find readily available on the internet, and so quoted by students. That's a long life indeed. I'd love to tell you a bit more about him. He was a protege of Isaac Newton. He was the main instigator of the Act of Parliament to try to solve the problem of longitude. If any of you have read the interesting book on that subject, he and a man called Humphrey Ditton set up a board to do that. And he came up with his own wacky idea, something to do with setting off explosions from boats at sea in specific locations. His views on biblical prophecy and millenarianism were arguably not so very far from Isaac Newton's own famous theories about expecting and calculating the end of time. Science and religion blended for both of them, and for many others of their age. But Isaac Newton was a rather difficult man, unpleasant to his rivals, and he never let Whiston become a fellow of the Royal Society. In any case, one big problem was that Whiston insisted on arguing out loud for the Unitarian position, which it seems Newton too privately favoured. Whiston declared himself a full subscriber of the ancient Arian heresy that made God the Father supreme and unique in substance, thereby attacking the Trinity in some measure. Didn't make him more favourable to Judaism, that made him very favourable to Josephus, as we'll see. He announced the discovery at one point that the 4th century Athanasian Creed that endorsed the Trinity for the Church of the future and became the backbone of Christianity was just a hoax. He was dismissed from his professorship, the Lucasian chair in Cambridge. Proceedings against him for anti-Trinitarianism were launched in 1710, inconclusively, but he could never return to Cambridge. So he started lecturing around London, both on science, giving public demonstrations and experiments, as well as on controversial religious topics. He'd become a Baptist. He developed theories about the lost tribes of Israel, the imminent approach of the end of the world, In 1726, he touted stories that circulated in London about a certain Mary Toft having given birth to rabbits, 2 of them, I think, as proof that the end of the world was nigh. He got to be known as something of a fanatic. He took around with him a wooden model of the Jerusalem temple, which would somehow be useful in the future age with the restoration of Jerusalem. And not just in London, he went to Bristol and Norwich, I think, and other places. So much for Josephus's great translator. Whiston, by contrast with his predecessor English translators, however, really does seem to have worked from the Greek, though previous ones had claimed to, and he stuck far more closely to what was in front of him than they had done. Even more importantly, for his usefulness, he guided the reader with footnotes, subheadings, diagrams, and appendices. His labours relied upon, one might say, pillaged several generations of scholarship on Josephus, including a great commentary made in the Netherlands by Haverkamp, based on a Greek text established in Oxford. The library that Thomas Jefferson sold to Congress contained Hudson, Haverkamp, as well as Whiston, and another critical text, Greek text. Anyway, Whiston's interpretation appears in the commentary, in the appended dissertations to his editions, and in which he'd written earlier, in fact, that got him into Josephus, and in his prefaces, and in visual material. He included it in, that's his first edition. There's no image yet in that one, funnily enough. No, there is no frontispiece that follows with the picture of Josephus, which comes to be standard in different forms, that engraving we saw. We'll see another version of it in a minute. Whiston had come to believe also that the biblical books of Josephus' Antiquities, behind Josephus' Antiquities, rested on a better text of the Hebrew Bible than any other, and certainly than the Masoretic text, which was and still is standard among Jews, but which Josephus claimed they had falsified and twisted. He was not, therefore, an advocate of the Jews. I can't now stop there's to tell you anything about his 2 predecessors, but only, although I would love to say that they were both remarkable figures in the English literature and culture of their day. Thomas Lodge, a contemporary of Shakespeare's, and that is really it's translated, as you see, from the Latin and French. He became a doctor and a Catholic late in life, a famous literary figure in Shakespeare's day. And this is from his dedication, where he praises both Josephus and the work to the skies, the choice, the propriety, the elegance, purity of the style. Most people now don't actually rate Josephus's writing quite that highly. But in any case, of course, he had to sell the book, and he wanted to recommend it to his patrons, so he would go on being supported. And there is Roger Lestrange, a restoration figure following the return of the monarchy after Oliver Cromwell, known as Mr. Filth in one of Bunyan's works, because he was one of the first popular journalists, and we know what they're like. And he also became censor. He wanted to cut out bits of Milton as being possibly subversive to the restored monarchy. So he too, and it's a jolly big job to translate all of Josephus, but he saw fit to do this. This guy looks like he was interested in rather more the life of pleasure and leisure, but there you go. Maybe we won't leave that on the board. It's on the screen. It's too unpleasant. We'll come back to it. Whiston proudly rejects dependence on Jewish scholarship. Thus, for example, on his plan of the reconstructed temple, there are a lot of plans of the temple in his even from his first edition. Many errors of the Talmudists and later rabbins are corrected, and those Christians who followed them are also corrected, he says. However, Josephus is not like the rest of his countrymen. That's the point. A note concerning the vulgar Jewish notion of witchcraft, in one of his footnotes, tells us that our Josephus, that's Whiston's words, was too wise to give any countenance to it, not like the other Jews. Josephus was a person, quote again, of the finest genius and abilities, of the most unblemished honour and integrity. Some of the most judicious critics have esteemed him equal to the best of the heathen historians. It's by now evident how it might also be useful for Josephus to be constructed as a crypto-Christian, to be both a Jew and a Christian. And that's the move Whiston made. In 1728, he'd included already, this was 9 years before the translation, in a collection of authentic records belonging to the Old and New Testament, his argument that Josephus the Jew was an Ebionite, which was a kind of Jewish Christian. In his 8th dissertation, eventually appended to the translation, he came up with the extraordinary notion that Josephus became Bishop of Jerusalem, to be identified with an unknown Joseph in Eusebius' list of the first bishops in the church history. Now, this was possible. Whiston works it all out because Josephus left Rome and went back to his lands in Judea after the Flavian patronage gave out. And then he got caught up with the church. There's also a thing called the Dissertation on the Short Discourse on Hades. A lot of editions of Whiston have only 2 dissertations, and they give you this one. It's a Christian work of unknown authorship, a manuscript, no great importance, but Whiston concluded that Josephus wrote that during his Christian period. He spots all sorts of stylistic similarities, and it's a sort of discourse on the afterlife, criticizing Greek views of it. And then there's a holy man called Bannus, who Josephus in his autobiography tells us he got caught up with in the wilderness when he was looking round for the right path to follow. And so Whiston decides that this Bannus was a Christian too, and that's already went right back. Now, this was not a new idea. A work of a sort of encyclopedia of 1542 by Thomas Eliot, the Bibliotheca, says already, hitherto wrote, it appeareth that Josephus's excellent wisdom and special grace had been received, and it repugneth not that in his heart he embraced the faith of Christ. But Whiston took all this to a new level of detailed proof. Yet the overall picture is less monolithic than all this suggests, and less one-sided. A crisscrossing at many points between Christian and Jewish interpreters of Josephus makes our author a meeting point and also a touchstone for the enormously complicated and uncomfortable, but often intimate dealings between the two groups. I think you'll be glad to hear that we've missed out Josephus' special reading of the mother who killed her, who ate her baby, the technophagia. We will not go back to pick it up. I only wanted to point out that Whiston stresses the sort of supersessionism, the overthrow of the Jews, more than the more modern translation. There we go, another Josephus. Oh, now, wait a minute. So, yes, there's a crisscrossing. When Christians began to interest themselves in the history of the Jews as a people, as part of world history, the pioneer French Huguenot, Jean Banage, composer of a Jewish history, and others like him, presented their work as continuations of Josephus, i.e. Jewish history was seen through the mirror of Josephus. And this tradition continued. English Whistons from the late 18th century onwards, and some other translations based on Whiston, had appendices bringing Jewish history right up to their own time in the Victorian period now. For example, going right down to the problem of the Emancipation Bill presented to the British Parliament in 1847. You would have this at the back of your Josephus. So now we're not going to look at that either. This is some more nasty stuff about Josephus being really very good, but the rest of his people, unlike all other Jews, it comes all from Bradshaw's translation, also a sort of Whiston derivative. Let not Josephus or the innocent Christians bear any such burden, and so on. There you are. There's Josephus. Let's have him again. Bronze modern statue sitting in his garden. So, another point of crisscrossing, and here I'm coming towards my conclusion. We do need, before we finish, to keep in play another participant intimately related to Josephus. And this is the way that Jews remembered him. It's known as Sefer Yosipon, the book of Joseph, if you like. This 10th century South Italian Hebrew production, whose author took the name Yosef bin Gurion after a rebel who figures in the pages of Josephus, used the writings of R. Flavius Josephus as a basis for a scattershot, partly legendary history of the Jews, from the Babylonian exile, through the fall of Masada and the end of the Jewish revolt, interweaving all sorts of other stuff, the foundation of Rome, the story of Hannibal, the Maccabees, material from the Bible, Daniel, Esther, Antiquities books 99 to 16 are there, and then he reworks a very anti-Jewish Latin free version of Josephus from late antiquity known as Pseudo-Hegesippus. This is a strange combination. It was often thought of as Josephus himself, but it has good stories, and it tells Masada as a very heroic and tragic story too. Of course, he went under the same name, Joseph. In the Jewish world, Yosipon was to retain extraordinary vitality and to live on, this sort of legendary Josephus, as an esteemed author into the 20th century. In some ultra-Orthodox circles, he's still there. And one fascinating and perhaps surprising zone of exchange between Christians and Jews in the pre-modern period, but also continuing beyond, is precisely over this Jewish Yosipon. Because as well, he acquired a Christian profile, and Christian translations from the Hebrew into Latin by Christian Hebraists in the 15th, 16th century began to be quite common. One renowned humanist scholar even struggled to make sense of him in Hebrew himself, learnt Hebrew for the purpose. And why? Because everything to do with Josephus was so important. Peter Morwen was a learned fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, and then he was dismissed for his evangelical convictions. He wrote the compendious and most marvellous history of the latter times of the Jews' commonweal. It was reprinted in England and the USA until the 19th century. It was a rehash of the Yosipon found within a medieval history, Jewish history by Ibn Daud, as translated into Latin by the Christian Sebastian Münster. Everybody is sort of like flies around the jam pot. You can see how complicated it gets. Incidentally, there are also many Arabic translations of Sefer Yosipon, recently edited by a young Israeli scholar. The multiple versions of Yosipon and Yosipon-derived texts and their traditions are fantastically diverse, but it's become clear that these traditions can't be divorced from the reception of Josephus proper. Yosipon was indeed considered to be Josephus proper by Peter Morwen. He decided that one name represented Josephus's paternal descent, the other his maternal line, so he wrote these different works. Maybe it was the original Aramaic version. And both Jews and Christians thought that this was somehow the history that Josephus wrote for the Jews. This goes together with what has been the reflex popular reaction among Jews to the real Josephus, often a deep reserve and even hostility. Surely it was impossible to deny that this was a traitor to his people, even if his later writings in their defense had made some partial amends. But was it? The first and most important of the modern historians of the Jews, Heinrich Gretz, operating in Germany, in Breslau, where Josephus' critical editor Benedictus Nieser was also working, declared at least 16 times in his long history that Josephus was a traitor. Even before Josephus lost Jotapata and did a bunk, he was already a wholly incompetent general. It goes on and on. In a nutshell, Josephus assisted the Romans in their destruction of the temple. So the Jews could read Josephon, but Josephus was more difficult to swallow. Gretz sympathized with the rebels. He did think that Josephus maybe redeemed himself, but the civic crown of a patriot he had lost forever. Gretz has contributed mightily because he was widely read in English versions and abridgments, particularly in America as well at the turn of the 20th century. And he's contributed mightily to the negative perception of Josephus among Jews and to preoccupations that have not subsided to this day. To dismiss Josephus as a convinced Roman lackey and an enthusiastic purveyor of propaganda remained compelling to his readers. Trials of Josephus were a familiar form of entertainment in youth groups, schools, and on the media during the last century, both in Eastern Europe at the beginning of the century and in Mandate Palestine and the fledgling state of Israel. And yet, Josephus was the indispensable man. For now it was the Jews who needed to recover their past, and in particular their past in their own land. At the same time, once emancipated, in order to take their place among the nations, they needed a national historian. Enter Josephus. And in order to become fully a part of European civilization, they needed a classical past. Enter Josephus, the composer of fine Greek history. Finally, he was a Jew accepted by the emperors, i.e., by the powers that be, by the nations of the world. And last but not least, a people requires a formative myth, a story of heroism, and Josephus had obligingly provided for the concluding climax to his Jewish war, the unforgettable account of the heroic suicide of the 960 heroic defenders of Masada, the last stand, the Alamo of the Jewish revolt. Much as he hated the rebels, Josephus gave them here a good send-off. It was inevitable, for all the differences in emphasis, that the Jewish rediscovery of the real Josephus, when it came, depended also on Christian scholarship. Without which, let me re-emphasize, we would have lost the entire body of work altogether. And the first translations of Josephus into Hebrew, for example, rested on the German version by Paret, which was a sort of Western, never as important, but a sort of Western produced in Germany. Most remarkably of all, and can I just tell you this story to end with? That great Anglo-Jewish organ, the Jewish Chronicle, founded in the 1840s, the oldest Jewish newspaper in the world, continues right through to the 20th century to teem with Josephus. It runs the gamut of types of response, from the most learned to scholarly learned little articles to scholarly book reviews, discussions of him within the Torah reading of the week when it's presented, the obituaries of scholars, Jewish and non-Jewish, who made contributions to Josephus studies. Those were the days when journalism was had a certain standard. So who else but Josephus could take center stage in the call for a new Jewish historian to come forward? In a children's corner of this newspaper in the 19th century, Auntie, through the early 20th century, before the First World War, Auntie, she called herself, through the Young Israel League, instructed the young in the rudiments of Jewish history, and she gave away prizes for their attempts at essays. The prizes were none other than copies of Whiston's So Very Christian Josephus, which seems fantastic. In January 1911, her loving nephew, Edward Barron, wrote to her, a young man, child, teenager, saying, "Dear Auntie, I'm very pleased with the prize. The works of Josephus, which you have sent me for the missing letter competition, I've long been anxious to know the sad history of the wars between our nation and the Romans. Now I shall have the opportunity of learning it from Flavius Josephus, Yosef ben Matityahu," he gives him his Hebrew name, in Hebrew lettering in the newspaper. "But I'm disappointed in his behavior in deserting his people in their need. I'd stay with them to the last drop of blood lasted, as Judas Maccabeus did, if it were me." And then from a remote corner of South Africa, a far-flung part of the British Empire, another young recipient, Joseph Levy, said, "I am descended from those who excelled the Romans in patriotism, the Greeks in wisdom and genius." So he's quoting Josephus in the Exeon Stapio, not quoting directly. "The Spartans in bravery and loyalty. While reading Josephus, I came across our triumphs and our afflictions, and a sudden longing for our fatherland gets hold of me. Thanking you once more for the beautiful prize." And thus the wheel had come full circle. The intensely Jewish Josephus had been a maker and remaker of Christian identity, even while the Jews were being vilified and abused by those same Christians. And then in turn the Christian Josephus had come back to become, through his narratives and his defense of Judaism, a maker and remaker of modern Jewish identity, even while he was being vilified and abused by many of those same Jews who had him to thank for giving them back their past. What next? The game can't be over yet.
Tessa's agreed to take a few questions, but while you're collecting your questions, I want to have the great joy of thanking Tessa for stimulating, engaging iteration of Josephus through the ages. And it was well worth waiting for. And when are you coming back?
Next installment. There's plenty more stuff there, but I'm sure you've had more than enough, more than a bellyful for tonight.
Does somebody have a question,
Yes.
please?
After all this period, all this time in the Restoration period and the Victorian age, I hate to take it back to the Flavian period, but I was just struck, I was thinking about, against Apion, and then when you talk about finding the man in the desert, the Bios, how he really seems to be foreshadowing the kind of apology that people like Justin Martyr will do for Christianity in the 2nd century by saying, no, this is the true philosophy, it's superior to pagan philosophies, etc., etc. And then I was thinking the colloquium yesterday about how 4th Maccabees in some ways does that. It says, we must combine Eusebeia with logismos. And so I was wondering, does Josephus have any sort of direct connection with people like Justin Martyr and other Christians who would sort of present Christianity as the true philosophy, or is this just a genre of Judeo-Christian apologetics?
Well, he has the same trope as Justin Martyr of actually looking at all the different philosophies and choosing the best one. And it seems to be, but you get it also in some pagan writers. You get it in Lucian of Samosata, I think. I tried, he says he tried Pharisaism, Sadduceeism, Essenes, then he went to this Banus and followed him for a year or something. And then in the end he decided Pharisaism, which was probably a sort of pre-rabbinic movement. We don't know exactly, but that was what he should be, so he says. And Justin Martyr does something similar, doesn't he? He meets an old philosopher on the beach who says to him, this is the true philosophy. He tried Plato and Aristotle and this and that. So from that point of view, but you know that with regard to 4 Maccabees, and this is another interesting thing to pursue. Many manuscripts of Josephus have also 4 Maccabees, and it used to be thought that they were written. The 4 Maccabees was written by Josephus. It's quite interesting. Hard to disentangle why. Whiston was. Some people have, at least one scholar, our Japanese colleague, has claimed that Whiston was the first to not include 4 Maccabees. I somehow doubt it, but I think someone else must have figured this one out. But it is interesting. The 4th book of Maccabees, for those who don't know, is a Jewish martyr text, which was very much taken up by the Christians, written in the 1st or 2nd century CE, very different from Josephus. I now think, looking again at the bit about the technophagia, the bit where the woman eats her child, which Christians love to repeat, that maybe that's why, because it says at one point that in spite of her maternal feelings, she did this. That ties up with 4 Maccabees. Sorry, this relates to our interesting colloquium yesterday. I won't go on about it. It's not so interesting for other people, maybe.
Others.
knocked everybody out.
You mentioned that there were Arabic translations. Who were the readers? Who were the Arabic? What was the Arabic readership? Do you know?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, if you ask me who the readers were, a lot of these, not lodge, but after that you begin to get lists of subscribers, because that is how I think printers sold books in the early modern period. I'm sure there's people here who know more about this than me. And those are often very ordinary people, you know. They are craftsmen of different types and innkeepers and so on. So that's within the British context. As for the Islamic versions of Josephus, I don't know. I know, and I haven't actually. I mean, the book is a very technical book which tries to compare the different texts and so forth. But equally, the letter of Aristeas had a big Arabic existence. The pseudo letter that is supposed to be by an Alexandrian Jew telling how the Bible was translated into Greek. That too, how this fits into, as it were, the commonwealth of letters, I ought to find out, but I don't know currently. But any help on that, I'd be very grateful for.
I was just wondering if you would say a little bit more about the designation of Jesus as Ha Christos in the Testimonium. I just thought that was very striking, and it was totally new to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, Ho Christos means, you know, the anointed one, Chrio, the baptized one. It certainly when it says just baldly like that, he was the Christ, it looks as though it comes from a crypto-Christian, like Whiston suggested. Though, I mean, I have read an interesting interpretation that tries to suggest that just means he was the Christ in quotes, i.e. he was the person that became called the Christ. So it is conceivable just to rescue the whole testimonium as being written by a Jew. And, you know, it's then a fairly positive report, but not necessarily a believer. But maybe, I mean, I could go back to it. There's possibly, let's see, there's maybe just too much there to accept. I don't know, I mean, he was one who wrought wonderful feats. Paradoxa erga is the word. Term. He was a teacher of such people. That already sounds like it's by someone who's convinced. And the truth. Why that? I mean, that in a way is a more problem, more difficult to dispose of, I think, as being not, you know, as not being Christian than Ho Christos. He won over many Jews, many of the Greeks. He was, the translation you see is misleading. It just says he was, well, maybe it isn't misleading. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused had condemned those who in the first place had come to love him, didn't. On the third day he appeared to them. Some people have said that's ironic, but it doesn't read like that. For the prophets of God had prophesied these and myriad other marvelous things about him. That too is actually quite accepting. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, is still up to now not disappeared. You can imagine people have done silometric tests, but it's too small a passage to really test the style and compare it. What else have people done? They have tried to fillet it to get to the authentic Testament. And actually an Arabic author called Agapias has a version of Josephus, the real Josephus, in, I think, also of the 10th century. And when people, at one point, there was a big flurry of excitement about maybe 30 years ago that this could be the authentic testimonium. And then there's one in the Slavonic versions of Josephus, in Old Slavonic, and a man called Robert Eisler in Germany in the 30s. And book was published in English after the war, tried to suggest that was the original testimonium, i.e. the pre-Christian one. But none of that is really convincing. So that's where it's at, I think. Still an open question, amazingly enough. But
I had heard somewhere before that that he mentions later in the Antiquities Jesus again, but doesn't introduce him. So it's had been thought that there needed to be something here if he mentions him and doesn't introduce him. I don't know if I'm misremembering.
Yeah, well, there is the passage on James. I don't know if you can read that. It's about Ananus the high priest. Here you are. Festus was dead. Albinus, another procurator, was on the road coming from Rome to rule Judea, that's to say. So he assembled the Sanhedrin. It should really say, this is an old-fashioned translation, sorry about it. It should say a Sanhedrion, which means a council, not necessarily the Sanhedrin. Brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed to be the most equitable of the citizens, such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. It's an odd passage. I actually don't trust that one very much. I'm in a minority here. I think, for one thing, Ananus is described as being a very gentle and decent high priest elsewhere, and here he's really criticized severely by Josephus, and the decent citizens were all uneasy. There's nothing specifically Christian, but it's strange, but it has the bit you were referring to, I think, in it. The man who was called the Christ, the brother of Jesus, and his name was James. Christian tradition has him thrown down from the pinnacle of the temple, James, I believe, not stoned. So it is different. That's it. There's also a piece about John the Baptist, simply saying that he baptized people for purification, I think, which doesn't mention Jesus, if I remember rightly.
I don't want to stop if anyone has other questions. If not, I'd like to again thank